I'm Leigh. Based on the chairman of the Cheshire and Wirral Raptor Study Group, we're affiliated to the North of England Raptor Forum, and what that means basically is we work with all the other study groups in the North of England and share information on monitoring of raptors, raptor persecution, etc., etc. So that's the kind of thing that we do. We also get information from the local barn groups, which are tremendous, by the way, and I'll come on to them a little bit later, and try and encourage people to show an interest in raptors, start monitoring them, and obviously conserve them in the long term. So hopefully my talk tonight will help you, everybody, do that. Okay, can everybody see that okay? Yeah. Right, I always want to cover a few things about really. So I want to cover what is a raptor, just kind of go over what a raptor is, and again, cover the overview of the species occurring in the county. These are species that spend either pass through the county, breed, or winter in the county, not vagrants, things like white-tailed seagull or some of these vultures that are kicking around at the moment, things like that. Then I want to just talk briefly on what the threats are to raptors, be it nationally or even in the county. Then I want to finish off with the tale of two farmer raptors. Basically what this is a little bit of a look at the decline of the kestrel and the increase in numbers of the buzzard. So without further ado, what is a raptor? Okay, you're all quite familiar with things like sparrowhawks and kestrels, things like that, but all raptors, whether it's an owl or a falcon or a hawk, have this hooked beak, eyes that either point forward in like a binocular vision, which help them to see prey in detail. They've got a far better eyesight than ours, and they're all basically a designed killing machine that fits their habitat and their prey. As you probably know, raptors and owls will eat all sorts of different things: birds, insects, small mammals. So the kind of obviously the tools that these birds have varies dependent on the habitat and when they hunt. So it's and how they hunt. So it's quite an interesting one. So obviously you've got large eyes, hooked beak, ready for tearing flesh, etc. Talons, which, as you can see here, this is a barn owl talon, and you can see that the talons with the feet with kind of like a padding which helps them to grip the prey, and most of the time these birds will either carry the prey in the feet or in the beak, and as they fly back to the nest or to a plucking post or wherever. Sometimes, and these things are sharp, and anybody who's listening now who's a ringer can verify that these talons are very, very sharp when you handle the birds. Yeah, I've got a few scars to back that up. When I was working, just to give you a little kind of experiential thing, is I was working as a consultant on golden eagles in Scotland, and we found the nest, and I was hopefully going to ring the golden eagles. And the Sunday before, we went ringing barn owls, and unfortunately I got one of these talons down my thumbnail. It's swollen the thumb. I had to go to the hospital to have it sorted out and get tetanus, etc., etc. Unfortunately, that meant I couldn't go and ring the eagles, so I've lost out on that one, which is it was unfortunate, but one of those things, unfortunately. And so here we are, sparrowhawk. Just most of you have seen a sparrowhawk in the garden, I guess, when you've been putting out. You put out bird food, they'll come and they'll hunt in there. This is what this is called a pigeon. As you can see, I mentioned before about the beak, the eyes, and you can see the talons, completely different than the barn owl ones I showed you before. But this one here, when she turns round, you can see it's absolutely built for tight flying. You can fly through really, really small gaps and bending around, etc., etc. So you know, these are just pure killing machines. And anybody who's seen them in the garden will just get a flash, and then with a flutter of feathers, and there you go. So, yeah, killing machines. All birds, all raptors will regurgitate pellets. Their stomachs are kind of acidic, and they'll mainly swallow food, and they will break down the fur and bones in the gizzard, and then regurgitate the pellets. So as you can see, the big ones, barn owl, you can see some kestrel ones and little owl ones. Generally, if you break them down, you can see what kind of food they're eating. In some cases, in little owls, you get things like beetle wing cases, things like that. And as you can see in the barn owl one, you get lots of different bones and fur and things. So it's really, really good thing to do to see what the birds are eating. So the hunting methods that the birds employ are as varied as the birds, dependent on the habitats and the prey they're after. So, you know, the swoop is generally, if any of you have ever seen a peregrine falcon swoop, it can reach up to kind of 150 mile an hour, swooping down and hitting a pigeon or another bird. And once the stoop with its talons out hit the bird, it's generally swirls out of the air, and it's basically dead on impact. Ambush, as we just seen the sparrowhawk before, they tend to fly in very, very quickly from confined spaces and ambush the unsuspecting bird, so it doesn't see it coming, and next minute it's hit. So, and then swooping. Swooping is generally, if anybody's ever seen barn owls hunt, they tend to swoop down on the voles. They generally fly very, very quietly because they're using the hearing. They've got offset ears and a kind of a facial disc, so all the sound goes into the ears. They can actually pinpoint where the prey is, and they will then kind of hover, then swoop down. And what they do is they push the head forward, and then in the last seconds, so they're kind of locating the prey using the hearing, and in the last second pull the head out and push the talons forward to catch the prey. So it's just very, very good, very interesting to see. And those of you who have been looking up to see that, it's really, really a spectacle. Post hunting, now this is an interesting one. You may have seen barn owls, little owls, kestrels do this, and generally what they tend to do this where it's either windy or rainy, and they can actually look from their post into kind of rough grassland or habitat where they may hold their prey. Generally in these times, they tend to use post hunting when it uses less energy than trying to fly over and find prey. So it's an energetic thing more than anything else. So it's used in poor weather conditions mainly, where they can't go out and hunt if it's either windy or you've got rainfall. So it's a really, really good way of hunting. On ground, lots of birds, things like buzzards and little owls, tend to hunt quite a lot on the ground, because those two kind of birds eat lots of earthworms, and you will get them sometimes now with the thermal imaging cameras. You can tend to see a lot more that's going on around you with birds, particularly on the ground. I remember working on little owl a few years ago in Tatton Park, and we were getting they were on the floor catching worms and lots of cockchafer beetles, things like that. So it's quite an interesting way that they do. If you look at the little owl on the screen there, you can see it's got quite, for the bird, I mean, they are related to the burrowing owl. They've got quite long legs really, and some of the nests we monitored, particularly when it's quite high rainfall, where they spent a lot of time on the floor, the front of the breast was actually saturated when they were coming back into the nest with worms and things like that. And in some cases, because the bird the birds were so wet bringing prey in, they actually transferred that to the young, and in some cases the nest was a real mess, and the young owls died because of that. So it's quite an interesting one. I've heard that on a few other birds that's happened too. So quite interesting. So what I think we'll start off with is just looking at the owl species that occur in Cheshire, and just giving a quick summary of the habits and in Cheshire, and a little bit more information on the birds. So we'll start off with this is a young tawny owl, and there's an adult tawny. I'm sure most people who are watching this are familiar with tawny owls, the twit-twoo. In the woodland, we're quite fortunate in Cheshire to have quite a lot of copses and woodland areas where they're frequented by tawny owls. And tawny owls generally will nest in cavities in trees, nest boxes, and sometimes in open nests, things like old crow's nests or squirrels, drays, if they need to. Well, they do prefer cavities, and I think I've heard on one occasion where one pair have been bred and they've been nested on the floor in a root system of a tree, which is again something that's quite rare, but it does happen. So this is a young tawny owl we've actually removed from a box, and again it's bringed, weighed and measured, and then popped back in the box, and it goes on its merry way when it gets old enough without that. So yeah, tawny owls quite yeah, they're not as successful as they used to be, and there's quite a number of inquiries that being run by the British Trust for Ornithology to understand the reasoning behind that. So it's quite an interesting scheme to get involved. So if you get a chance to get involved with any monitoring of tawny owls using callback, etc., it's always a good thing to do. The barn owl, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. The barn owl is a really good one in Cheshire. In the early 70s, 80s, these birds were really at a low ebb in the county, and I remember starting to work on them, and we were working with Colin Schreier and a guy called Paul Johnson at the time from the Hawk and Owl Trust, who came up here to advise us on some methods to encourage them. And I remember Paul Johnson, particularly at the time, who actually got me into studying little owls, because we didn't have enough barn owls around, and we had at the time probably between 10 and 15 pairs in the county. And as I mentioned earlier, the groups that are formed now, and a number of them have been going for nearly 15, 20 years, and beyond 20 years, they've done a tremendous job in talking to farmers, influencing how they run and manage, lots of nest boxes and monitoring the boxes too. And we're up to now probably nearly 200 pairs in the county, which is tremendous. It really is. There's a lot of variability with numbers, and that depends on the vol year and other influences, things like weather, etc. But the testimony must go to the barn owl groups. And as you can see, there's the Mid Cheshire Barn Owl, which I'm a member of. We cover the kind of middle of Cheshire, as I suggest, but also we cover them down into Crewe, Nantwich, and these groups are always looking for helpers. So if anybody wants to join them, I'm sure if you go on the website and have a look. But there's quite a lot. We've been monitoring these birds for a number of years. We basically go out and find out how many young there are, and ring them, weigh them, measure them. There's methodologies of actually aging them right to the day. So we try and find out as much of that as we possibly can. And when you've got the ring numbers, and then you can go out again and catch them, it's really good to see whether they've succeeded through to the following year and actually succeeded to breed. As they tend to, when we started to do some analysis on movements from nest boxes, barn owls don't tend to move very far from the natal site. They tend to kind of look for similar habitats and just basically fill in areas where they're not barn owls at the time.
However, there's quite a lot of new research being undertaken now by, particularly in Switzerland, where they're finding out that where we've seen barn owls in boxes and we've seen the male and female and they've raised chicks, that's not necessarily the happy story we think it is. There can be a lot of divorce goes on in there, and they're finding out that, you know, that male and female change quite regularly, and it's not the normal just one male and one female raising young in that same box every year. It can be a different male or it could be a different female, and that happens more than we know about. So it's something I'm quite interested in, and want to start to do some investigations in that, starting by catching some of the adults in the winter and trying to get them and look at the site fidelity to see whether the same male and female are together year on year on year. So it's something interesting to embark on. I'm hoping that the other groups will help me to do that. So it's these little about 40 days old, those. So yeah, it's interesting birds. And as you can see that the female, when she starts laying the eggs, will start to incubate them straight away. This is why you get the age range from this oldest one to this youngest one here. And in cases where we have poor fall years and they're struggling to eat, the poor little one at the end sometimes gets eaten, unfortunately. But that's if that's the difference between some of these other ones surviving, I suppose it's a price they have to pay, unfortunately. Little owl. This is, as I mentioned before, something I've been working on for a number of years, and with this quite a lot, and it's actually a declining bird. The little owl's got quite an interesting history. As many of you may know, the little owl, it isn't. Well, we think the little owl isn't a native species, or there are some theories that they were, but the population we have at the moment originated from a number of introductions which were undertaken in the late 1800s, and the most notable one was the one by a gentleman called Lord of Lilford in the kind of in the Rutland area, Leicestershire Rutland area, and he released hundreds over a 10-year period, and these birds basically started to spread from Rutland, started to come west, and then they gradually came to a halt, and that coincided with the outbreak of the First World War. So most of the gamekeepers then went off to fight the Germans, which allowed the little owls to spread, and so they really proliferated and went into the Midlands, and really went up into Yorkshire from that area, and then they went east into Norfolk and Suffolk. So yeah, interesting bird. One of the good things about them is that they do tend to, like I said before, they're not native, but they've got a really good niche where they don't really compete with any other birds. So they're not really a pest species. Some gamekeepers may think they are, but there was a massive outcry, well, not long after the introductions, that they were taking lots of pheasant poults, and an investigation was undertaken by the BTO, and found that when they started to look at the owls' nest remains, as you can see here, and they have some of these owls sometimes have caches where they keep the food. They found that they were eating a lot more songbirds and small mammals rather than pheasant poults. They were taking some pheasant poults because obviously raptors will take what's available to them, but they weren't taking as many as the gamekeepers thought, which is quite good. What we did find out when we started to look at when I did some research on going back over history of these birds, that little owls tended to spread and then stop, and then these tended to avoid higher ground, things like the Pennines. They were quite difficult to get across the Pennines into the northwest of England, and also the Cumbrian Mountains and the Snowdonia, where they tended to have to kind of circumvent them rather than try and go over the top of them. And what we did find at the time is that they tended to like orchards, and a lot of the farms in Cheshire had a kitchen orchard, and they used to welcome the little owls, because the little owls used to keep down the pest species in the farmland or in the farm orchards. So they were started to be more welcomed, and I'm sure most of you will agree that they are a great attribute to our avifauna, and they're little characters, and there's nothing to see picking that one up there, and they've got their eyes and they look at you. They tend to just look at you with disdain, which is quite funny, but they're quite nice characters. The long-eared owl. Long-eared owls is quite a difficult one to explain, really. They come into the county. They are generally hunt small mammals and voles mainly, and nest in trees like old magpies or squirrel drays. We think we've only got a handful of these nesting in the county, although they're very, very difficult to find. What we do get sometimes are eruptions coming in the winter time, and we tend to get more birds seen in the winter time than the spring and summer. A lot of the birds that in eruptions come from Scandinavia, and they'll come across the North Sea and come into England and then move. This is generally when there's a lack of food resources in Scandinavia. But you will see these birds. They're beautiful birds, and they're quite, looking at that one there, they're quite large when you see them on the wing, because they have quite large, broad wings, and really nice birds. The short-eared owls. We used to have short-eared owls breeding in the uplands, upland Cheshire, which there's not much of, I must admit. But don't believe we've got any nesting in the Cheshire, over the border into Cheshire now. They're generally into Derbyshire, and they're in low numbers. But the best place to see short-eared owls in the county is if you visit the Dee estuary, whereas you'll see them hunting and quartering there, looking for prey. And magnificent bird, and hunting small birds and small mammals mainly. Okay, we'll move on to falcons now. The Merlin, similar story to the short owl in the uplands, which have unfortunately died out, and the best place to see them again is in the estuaries. You'll see them there quartering again. Flight, very, very fast flight bird, smaller falcon, excellent, and hunting birds, things like meadow pipits and things like that. The hobby. The hobby is increasing in numbers in the county. We're seeing a few more of them turn up every year. As many of you may know, they migrate to Africa and come back, and the kind of quite an interesting thing is that they nest in old crows' nests. And what we're finding is that, and what I've been told, I'm not an expert on hobbies by any way and means, because there's small numbers in the county, that they tend to like carrying crow nests, particularly that have been used in the year preceding, in the actual year they come back. So they're looking for a nice warm nest, I think, really, which is quite interesting. Again, the great hunters will hunt in the air, will take things like dragonflies, hirundines, things like swallows and sand martins, that type of thing. But they're tremendous birds, beautiful looking birds. Peregrine falcons. We've got a number of peregrine falcon nests within the county. A few of them, I guess, you probably possibly know a few of them, and they'll nest on high-rise buildings, cliffs, etc. And I've been working on a number of projects in the UK where they're actually working on buildings where they've got peregrines, so we've had to do some monitoring of them, and provision of alternative nest sites. And the good thing about the sites that they're choosing in the county is they're very, very secure. So if you look at this building here, high-rise building, you can see on their ledges plucking points for peregrine, where they've actually been on or something, and they've plucked it there and left it. And you can see also some guano down there where they've actually left the droppings. There's not a nest there, but it's certainly an interesting site near to where they're probably near to the nest. So this is a site in Cheshire which I don't personally monitor, but Professor David Norman monitors. But I was able to go with him and ring some birds a few years ago, and you can see the peregrine nest there, which is on the ledge. This is a chemical plant in Cheshire. As I mentioned before, some of these sites are industrial sites, and the byproduct of that is that they're very, very secure. They've got security guards, and they protect the birds. But the thing is about peregrines is obviously that they're obviously very vulnerable to disturbance, and they're highly protected in Schedule 1 species. They're valued for not just their eggs, but they're very, very valuable for the falconry asset too. That people will spend a lot of money to get a peregrine falcon chick, so it's important that we protect them. And you can see here, which is where we've been ringing them. One of the chaps from the chemical plant has invested a lot of time keeping his eye on the birds, so it's only right that he gets to have a look at them and see his babies. You can see we've got a coloured Darvik ring on the legs, and when we ring these birds, we take DNA swabs from them, and we put Darvik markers on them too. We take the DNA swabs so we can actually trace them, just in case something illegal did happen. We can actually track these birds, and also we have the Darvik rings on so we can actually visibly see them, so we don't have to catch them again. We can see where they've come from and what year they were actually hatched, so we can see that, so we can track them down. Like I say, in the northwest, we've got quite a lot of birds on town halls and large buildings, high-rise buildings. I've been working in London on some peregrines. If you think of London, there's probably about 20 pairs of peregrines in London now, and it's quite interesting really, because obviously high-rise buildings provide an excellent artificial cliff face, and the amount of birds you get in city centres now, either pigeons or waterfowl or gulls or whatever, and the peregrines like, well, I've got plenty of food. One of the problems we've had with persecution of peregrines is pigeon fanciers have a problem with them, because obviously they take their birds, and there's been a few problems with persecution of peregrines by pigeon fanciers in the past, by shooting them or poisoning some of their pigeons, believe it or not, and to kind of pass that on to the birds, which is dreadful, but it's unfortunate. The thing is, with peregrines now, they're starting to recover from a lot of issues they've had in the past with DDT, which is a pesticide, which was discovered in the 50s and 60s that peregrines were declining in numbers, and it was an investigation found that the pesticide which passed through the food chain into the peregrines was causing their eggs to thin. So when the female was incubating the birds, incubating the eggs, she was breaking the eggs, and obviously there was no output from the nest. So therefore, you only need that over a few years, and the population starts to sink. And that population was already quite low anyway, because in the Second World War, particularly when some of the pigeons that used to use for bringing in messages were getting predated by peregrines. So some of the MOD at the time used to control the numbers of peregrines because of that. So all interesting stuff. Kestrel, I'm going to speak a little bit more in a little bit more detail about the kestrel later. I'd like to say, you know, obviously the people who run the barn owl groups do quite a lot of good work on kestrels too, because they tend to enjoy moving into barn owl boxes too, although there are quite a lot of purpose-made ones around now. But kestrels, tremendous birds, in decline, unfortunately, and it'll be good to, when Sonny gets a grip of why this is, and these little monkeys are trying to survey them. Believe you me, they can. Their talons, they look quite harmless there, but the talons have got quite a sharp, and you lie on the back with the feet up when you're trying to strike them, when you put your hand in. And yeah, great birds. And like I say, I'll speak a little bit more about them in a bit. Red kite. The numbers of red kites are starting to increase in the county. Numbers of sightings of red kites are starting to increase in the county, and which is good to see, because we're hoping that, you know, whilst we've not had any definite breeding attempts, we think it's in the post over the next kind of 10 years. We hope we have a pair going in. We're not too far from some really good source populations, like Shropshire, which has started to get a good population of red kites now, and North Wales, where the red kites there are starting to range a little bit further from the you're generally restricted to the mid Wales ranges, and but they're starting to come a little bit more north now. The thing before was that a lot of the birds were being held back from moving any distances by the feeding stations that they used to have in mid Wales, and that was preventing lots of movements. But you know, we never know. We haven't had them yet, but I can say them in the post. With marsh harrier, this is a little bit different. Marsh harriers are the generally seen, as the name says, around marshy areas and estuaries and things like that. Although those of you who've been across to Lincolnshire, Cambridgeshire and areas, you'll see them, the birds nesting in arable fields, things like corn and any kind of really dense vegetation, which crops and things like that. So, but it's great to know that some birds breed on the marshes and Frodsham marshes, and also Woolston, where I think they're bred for the first time this year, which is really good to know. They are polygamous, so you can maybe get one male servicing 2 or 3 nests, and so if the kind of the way that they colonised the southeast is anything to go by, we hopefully should be on the start of a really good colonisation in Cheshire and the northwest. Excuse me, and which is really good to know, because absolutely beautiful birds. Those of you who have been lucky to see them in those areas, and also, you know, from many years ago, and still are at Leighton Moss and areas like that. It's they're really nice. They put up a really good display, and they're really good birds. In hen harriers, although we've got no nesting sites in the county, we've had birds prospecting up in the areas of Macclesfield Forest and places like that. Although these are highly persecuted birds, as I'm sure most of you are aware and seen in the press about the various things and the various recovery programs that are ongoing at the moment. And I'm not going to get into that, because I know it's very, very political, and there's quite a lot of negativity about various things. But as you probably know, that areas in Bowland where they've actually satellite tagged some of these birds, and the birds have gone missing, and lots of issues have happened regarding persecution in terms linked to grouse moors and things. So it's a difficult one, really. But these birds again move vast distances and will come down. And most of these birds, like a ringtail female and the male, are readily seen on the the estuary during the winter time, and putting up a spectacle, flying, catching, flying, hunting and quartering for birds and things. A goshawk. This is obviously a sparrowhawk, and but much larger than a sparrowhawk. Takes larger prey, and again, it's in terms of Cheshire, we get sightings. We get potential territorial sightings where the birds are soaring and displaying, but we've not found any nests recently. They used to breed years ago. We've not seen anything recently, which is a shame because these are tremendous birds, and they will control things like mid-sized birds, things like sparrowhawks, and foresters love them because they keep down things like grey squirrels and elite grey squirrels, so which benefits all sorts of other birds, and obviously forestry, so the squirrels aren't eating the shoots and things. So it's a really cracking bird. Sparrowhawk. The sparrowhawk is very difficult to put your finger on the numbers in the county. It's quite prevalent, and those of you probably have seen them in your gardens, they tend to be quite difficult to find the nest from that. And so we can only, in terms of sightings, they tend to be, it's it's probably a relatively common bird, really, and excellent to see. They tend to nest in trees, and we'll feed exclusively on birds, and it's generally time their breeding to coincide with when things like blue tits and lots of the passerines are fledging, so they've got lots of easy picking, so it tends to be quite interesting to see that, really. It's how they do that timing. Common buzzard. I'm going to speak a little bit more about common buzzards later, but I'm sure everybody admires common buzzards. They're absolutely beautiful birds, and there's nothing better than to see them displaying on an early spring day where you can get them doing tumbles and grappling the talons and things. So ospreys, they tend to pass through both ways to the north, Scotland or northern England, and because obviously Cheshire's got quite a lot of meres and water bodies, they tend to stop off and catch some fish and roost up overnight, then move on. So we did start to think about looking at putting some platforms up for ospreys. And the problem we've got is that we need somewhere where we can actually be away from the public. And there's quite a lot of interesting things with ospreys and how to attract them to these. So you have to put a massive platform up and with a big nest in it, and then put some white paint on the nest to make it look as if it's got all osprey poo on it. Now that brings them in, and but we're trying to locate somewhere to do it, but it's quite difficult in Cheshire because most of the water bodies that they tend to use, like Roston or Budworth Mere, or tend to be, there's quite a lot of people around there, and where do we put a box which is not going to get disturbed? Sorry, where do we put a platform that's not going to get disturbed? Because they're all quite big structures, and they'll have to go high in a tree, or they'll have to go on a pole. So it's something we're still considering at the moment, because how good would it be really to have some breeding ospreys going on? I mean, they are in Wales. They're in the Lake District, so they're all around us, and we know for a fact that they've actually spent weeks in this area too, particularly in Fiddler's Ferry, and they've been spending quite a lot of time there. Okay, I think it was last year or the year before, they spent quite a lot of time fishing there. So there's obviously the resources around, so it's something that we might need to think about. We did discuss it with Roy Dennis a number of years ago, but we didn't get it off the ground. That's maybe something we might need to revisit. Okay, I think I've mentioned a few things about threats to raptors. I mean, obviously raptors are quite, emotive, and the thing is obviously that I don't know whether many of you, there's been a report published today by the OSPB reviewing the 2020 statistics of persecution, and I think last year, 2020, during the lockdown, was the worst year ever for records of persecution of raptors around the country, which is it's sickening really, because we're living in a modern world here, and we have to, we're trying to push for rewilding areas and things like that, and this is what we're up against, unfortunately. So persecution, shooting of raptors, trapping of raptors. I've seen them a number of pole traps where they've been set for catching. Discussing goshawks earlier, what they tend to do is set a pole trap on top of a post, which will attract a raptor, and then it just clamps on the leg, and then it just dies a painful death over kind of the days following. So it's not good. I mean, poisoning is another one, and this comes in all different ways. Many years ago, I'm not going to give away my age, but I was out with a friend, and we were in Tatton. I used to live in Mobley, that's where I was born and brought up, and we used to go to Tatton Park, and this was in the 70s, and we saw first 2 buzzards coming to breed in the park, and 2 weeks later, they were missing. The gamekeeper there and put some poisoned rabbits down, and they obviously killed them both. And that kind of resonated with me at the time. Obviously, it's happening quite readily now, and I notice there's lots of records of dogs being killed by poisoning, and it's just indiscriminate. Foxes, and anything that goes near an area, and it's a difficult one really to get my head around, if I'm honest. But there's also other kind of ways that raptors and owls are poisoned, and I don't know whether anybody has ever seen the Rodenticide that is used now, and this is readily used in farms and in also in areas where they've got problems with rats or mice, and it's put down and left out, and the mice obviously ingest it. And what it's designed to do is to stop them reproducing, and also it causes internal bleeding. It's an anticoagulant. So if you've got a mouse, if you think about it, you've got a mouse which has been affected by this poison, and it's obviously going to be running slower. It's going to be more in the open, so it's going to be an easy picking for a barn owl, for example. And if that is happening quite readily, it's not going to take long before the barn owl's eating several of these poisoned mice or rats, and then it passes it onto the owl. And I've seen things when I visited the barn owl trust where they've showed me some of the livers of these birds, and the liver's basically just bleeding, and these birds die from internal bleeding because of the anticoagulant, and it's terrible. It's terrible. And I mean, I must admit, it's not just owls and birds; it's also other things like polecats and stoats and weasels that catch these animals too. So obviously, that's something that needs to be looked at. Loss of habitat. I mean, this is a big one, really. It's a lot of the habitats where we're losing hedgerows or woodland, and the areas that birds tend to be the rough, and there's kind of bits of scrub where there's lots of birds or there's lots of food, and they tend to be the first to go when the fields are made larger, or we we build a house or something like that. So, you know, we have to start to think about balancing this and hoping and various things. So that's something. Climate change is going to affect us all in the long term. Even the climate change where we're getting a lot more rain in the spring, and that affects anybody who's listening who's a member of the barn owl group will know that obviously we get a wet spring. It affects the barn owl breeding performance, and sometimes they won't even breed because they can't go out and hunt. Or if they do breed early and it starts to rain, then they can't go out and hunt, and either the female will desert the eggs, or the chicks will die. And so it's things like this really that I need to look at, and I think there's quite a lot of research actually looking at egg laying dates combined with the global warming now to see what the shifts are. So it's quite an interesting one, really. Egg collecting is not as much as an issue as it used to be, although it still does occur where you get somebody collecting eggs out of the nest for collections and things. But I think that's a bit of a dying art now, fortunately. But it still does occur, and we've known that some boxes have had eggs taken out of them. I don't know who's done it, and it's something that is criminal anyway. But it's something which we can't really stop happening, apart from kind of keeping nests secretive, and or if it is something that's ultra rare, having some kind of watches on it and things like that. So it's something that theft of young. A few years ago, David Norman asked me to ring some peregrines at Beeston Castle, and I guess most people here know Beeston Castle, and there is a peregrines breeding on the cliff face. We went to ring the young, and the climbers went over the side and came back up, no chicks. And so in investigation, which was undertaken, that some people have been there either the night before or a couple of nights before and taken the young out of the nest. And as I mentioned earlier, the peregrine falcons are worth a fortune. Excuse me. These birds obviously were unringed, and it's something that's obviously happens quite a lot, unfortunately. We've also had birds taken from kestrels taken from a box where we went to ring them. They were too young to ring when we went there, and so we just numbered them. So we were doing some work on the growth of them. And there were 5 chicks when we went there, healthy chicks, and we went back and there were 3. And so two chicks had come out somewhere. They weren't. There's no reason to believe they were eaten by the siblings or by the adults, or there was any predation by something like a stoat or a weasel. It was certainly that we felt that there was a theft of the young, and I think that's also happened to colleagues of mine who've lost barn owls out of boxes. Now, I remember that with the onset of Harry Potter, that a lot of people wanted owls, and it was a downside of that, really, that we lost some owls to that. So anyway, and obviously urbanisation, roads being built, railways, which is a big thing, being built, and all the kind of infrastructure around them causes problems really with barn owls and kestrels. If you think of barn owls and kestrels hunting along the side of the road, the kestrel hunts quite high and hovers and drops down on the prey, whereas a barn owl will drift along, and you get a large lurry, high-sided lurry going in. It sucks the birds in, and they get killed. There's quite a lot of road deaths, as we know. I think the new A5, well, it's not new now, the A556 at Bowden, there was 2 young barn owls first year-born I was killed on the intersection there, something like 2 or 3 months after it was built. So, and this tends to happen generally when the birds are dispersing from their natal site and then looking for kind of a new territory. They tend to follow linear features, things like river corridors or woodland edge, that type of thing. So if they follow that and it kind of intersects a road, that's when you have the problems. And they also have problems when the road banks of the road are left to go rough, and you get lots of small mammals that are actually living in there and runs in there and things like that. So that'll attract prey birds in there, birds of prey in there. So that's another problem, really. So that's kind of the end of my first part of my talk. And what I would like to just concentrate on now is kind of, as I mentioned before, the tale of two raptors, where you've got obviously Buzzard and Kestrel. And what I kind of want to look at is look at the kind of, as you can see, the different population trends for kestrels and buzzards, and a kind of a brief overview of the ecology of the birds, and discuss recent population of the species, and identify some gaps in our knowledge, and flag up some potential future studies, which we've already started actually. But anyway, so kestrel, I think I mentioned before, kestrels like nest boxes. They are like cavities in trees. They tend to like cavities and boxes really more than open nests, and they tend to do quite well in those kind of areas, so they tend generally kind of between 2 and 5 eggs, depending on it. We noticed that the birds, depending on how old the bird is and how experienced the bird is, gives the number of how many eggs they lay, and also how much prey is around too. So these two kind of influences really. So if you get an older bird with lots of prey, then they'll probably have 5 or 6 young. And then, of course, what I find is I've never found any issues regarding birds dying in the nest. So if they hatch them, generally they fledge them, and that's what I found in my kind of experience. In terms of numbers and distribution, we found that we get more coming into Cheshire in the winter time, and I think those birds, we don't definitely know, but we think those birds do come from the uplands, things like maybe in the Peak District, or possibly even from the uplands of Wales or anything like that. So it's kind of swelled. You get more birds, and then noticed in the early spring that the birds then tend to kind of go back to the base. We also noticed some traditional nest sites, and this one particularly, which is not far from where I live, as you can see, there's no mistaking I used kestrel box. They decorate it so well, and they also decorate all around it out down on the base too, so you can't miss it. So they tend to. We've noticed that when a nest site which has been used year on year, one of the pair dies, the kind of nest site dies too. You haven't started. There's no kind of overlap with other pairs where you get a new adult coming in and filling the void. So it suggests really the floating birds within the population is quite low. So these are obviously the nests, as I mentioned before. These are vicious little characters. They don't look it, but when you put your hand in, they'll grab you, and you do quite a lot of damage. But cracking birds. So a picture we took with a torn egg in a kestrel, which is quite an interesting. We don't know what happened there, but it was there. So as you can see with some of the BTO data that everything's going down in terms of obviously the population index. Now this is based on the common bird census and breeding bird surveys, and it's quite old, if I'm honest, and probably needs updating. But you can start to see that the kind of index is going the wrong way, and I think that the same goes for kind of fledglings per breeding attempt too. They're starting to decline from, obviously, what's it, about 4 to possibly 3, which can be quite a significant change really. In food and foraging, as I mentioned before, the feeding strategies, a lot of it is dependent upon the vole populations that we get, and as with barn owls, but the difference in the two, if you think about the barn owl, will breed twice a year, will have 2 broods, because kestrels don't do that. So you've got a lot more, and the breeding season of a kestrel is a lot more, it's a lot shorter than that of a barn owl. I've been bringing barn owls in the last week of October, so so it shows that the barn owl is a lot more robust in terms of being able to break out of a population downturn than a kestrel is. This is from the breeding bird atlas undertaken in Cheshire a number of years ago. So the green dots are present in, these are gains basically, the green dots, and the red dots are losses. So you can see where, and obviously the yellow ones are static ones where they're present in both. So you can see there's quite a lot of red there, but it's quite spread out. There's no kind of real pattern and distribution there while that is. So mainly, obviously, the kind of what we thought was that there's obviously traditional breeding sites are failing, or not even, birds aren't returning to them. There's also less observations in the spring months, which gives you an idea that there's probably less birds around. Obviously, this is kind of what we're thinking of is consequences of hard and wet winters. And again, the wet winter is a key, where at the moment we're not really suffering with hard winters with lots of snow cover. We're suffering a lot more with wet winters with lots of flooding, and which from a kestrel's perspective is really negative. And of course, obviously, the intensive farming is probably not an issue around in Cheshire, apart from obviously there's quite a lot of pasture, which you don't get the kind of rough tussocky grassland that these birds like, and so where you get lots of prey. So yeah, that's that. So common buzzard, I'm sure you all agree that the sightings of buzzards have actually has kind of gone through the roof. Everywhere you go, you see buzzards, and it's just great, really. I think it's great to see them. They make you feel good. And like I said before, there's nothing better on a spring morning hearing them mewing and grappling, etc. So in terms of nest site selection, I mean, buzzards tend to use old crow nests and tend to be quite high up in a tree. Their egg numbers are between obviously 1 and 4, 5 maybe sometimes. And the fledged young tend to be lower, tend to be and they tend to be spread. They tend to, in terms of density dependence, they tend to be quite well spread in terms of they tend to control each other's. They're quite territorial, so they will keep away from each other, or by having lots of kind of frenzied mewing and calling and battles and soaring and things like that, and forcing each other away from the centre of their territory. In terms of dispersal, well, I'll come on to that a little bit later, but they tend to disperse away from their natal site in quite long distances, and then come and fill in, return, and they tend to be sexually mature, breeding in about year 2 or year 3, and then they'll return to breed from near to their natal area and fill in between. So again, if you look at the laying dates and fledglings per breeding, you can see fledgling per breeding is different than the Kestrel one. It's actually going up, and the laying dates tend to be quite constant, really, and which is always a good thing. So in terms of a dial buzzard, one of the reasons why they're successful, they look at all sorts of things and have a good range of diet species. You can see what I've got. I've just arrowed a mole in this buzzard's nest here, but I've known when I've been surveying, actually researching, that they'll eat both live prey and they'll, as you know, you've probably seen, they'll eat carrion. They'll also can eat rabbits are the key, really. And when the birds were the kind of low ebb of their population in the 60s and the early 70s, the reasoning for that was because that's when the height of myxomatosis had affected the rabbit population. So the buzzard population mirrored that. But if you look at them, sometimes you'll see them on the ground eating earthworms, eating slugs and snails, and obviously they'll eat small mammals, they'll eat birds. And one of the research I had, I was watching a pair, and it went and brought back a young carrion crow. They consumed it in the nest. It went back again and brought another carrion crow, and it wiped the whole nest of carrion crows out and to feed the nest. So it just shows you how the kind of they'll do. So I can say this one, it's got rats, and you can see this one here. You've got a ratter here, you've got a shrew there, and you've got the remains of a pigeon there. So that shows you how varied they are. And need to say anything about that, really. This is probably all green now, I'd say. Even in the city centres, you're getting sightings of buzzards. So obviously, this is one of the reasons why the population is increasing. As I mentioned before, population recovery of the rabbits, the wide selection of prey, lack of natural predators, which is a big thing, increased legal protection, although I'll mention that in a minute, declining gamekeepers who control them illegally, and then, of course, the Cheshire landscape and proximity. Cheshire landscape is perfect. If you look at across, if you took a Google Earth snap of Cheshire, you can see all the different copses, which are strategically positioned. So you could probably say, yes, there's a buzzard nest in that one, there's a buzzard nest in that one, and they're all spaced out really, really well. And one of the things that I'm very, very passionate about is in protection of buzzards is that I don't know whether you know this or not, but gamekeepers release, as you know, a lot of pheasants, and in some areas they're actually applying for licenses to kill buzzards to protect their pheasants. And for me, I think it's completely and utterly wrong, because let's be honest, pheasants don't even belong in this country, and buzzards do. That's one thing. Buzzards are native and pheasants aren't. And game rearing is an industry, and no wild bird should be persecuted for safeguarding game. So that's my. I'll get off my hobby horse now. So, like surveying buzzards in Cheshire. This is a short video of Sam Harmer, the son of Andy, who helped me this year go into a nest, and whilst we're on, I was trying to look for. This is a high spruce tree, as you can see, right at the top. Buzzards with 2 chicks. So Sam's extracting them carefully and safely from the nest. As you can see, if you look at the nest, you can see there's quite a lot of greenery in there, and they do tend to keep the nest quite well decorated with a bit of greenery here and there. And so Sam's taking the chicks out and putting them in a bag very carefully. And yeah, it was really grateful to Sam because there's no way I could climb this. So we put them in the bag. Made it nice and secure. A quick check in the nest, because one of the good things about, as you saw, you get a lot of information from whole nests, what they've been eating and various things like that. So Sam had a bit of a look around in that nest when we were processing the birds. So this is the birds in the bag. And so obviously we had dropping them down carefully to me at the bottom. And the moment you see this coming down, you'll see how high this is. There's no way you're going to get me up there. It was a really good spot, and these pictures are being taken by Andy, who's operating a drone above. So he actually used the drone to. It's really good use of technology to check on the nest to see where the nest was up to. You can see where I am now, so how high that is. So he came back to me, and then obviously we get the chicks out, we weigh them, measure them, try and sex them. At this age, it's quite difficult to sex. The females are generally bigger than the males. But what we do is we take measurements of the knuckle on there to look at the width, so we can actually look at the males and females. And then obviously the Pop and Sam, we put them back in the bag, and Sam put them back in the nest. And then just so you know what they're like when they go back and are accepted by the mum. And these are the birds. A couple of weeks later. And so that's obviously something we want to increase that. So anybody out there listening to me who wants to get involved, wants to try and find nests, please contact us, because it's coming to winter now. Now's the time really to start looking for nests in trees and getting an idea of where buzzards could be. And then obviously early spring, start to look at where you're getting birds above copses and woodland, and start to see the interaction between the male and female, and also driving other buzzards away. So like I say, if you want to get involved, I think the email's around, so if anyone wants to contact me, that's fine. Okay, this is something which is a project which is a colleague of mine called Steve Finney's been undertaking in on the Wirral, and Steve has been as we've been doing ringing the birds, but he's also actually going a step further, and he's been fitting them with potagial tags, which are these plastic tags which are fitted to the potagial tag joint on their wing. This stays with them for life, so we can actually look at what Steve does. He fixes one wing, which is I think it's the year and the area. So we can actually, when these are, because there's quite a few projects going at the moment with buzzards and also red kites, and sometimes people do confuse the species, so we have to comply with what tags people are using in other areas on both species. So you get one wing is of a colour which is of the area, and the other wing is the birth year of the bird. So he's done quite a number of these birds, and as you can see, there's one. So they've only got a sky blue one and a green one, and obviously got his BTO ring too. So he's well kitted out, and obviously early results indicate that the birds move away from the natal area in when and then they return to the natal area, like I explained before. And some of these sightings are quite amazing. This one here was from a field in Milton Keynes. We've also had some sightings in mid Wales, but most birds stay within 20 kilometres of the natal area, and no real pattern showing preference or direction. Like I said before, buzzards generally breed at 3 years, and therefore more work is required to whether the birds are returned to take up their territory close to the fledged site. So it's quite good, and it's quite exciting really to get to grips with this and do more work. And so going back to the very start, a lot of people have suggested that kestrels have died out because buzzards have come in, and like I've demonstrated in this talk here, that buzzards are opportunists and they'll take a variety of prey, particularly during the breeding season. And we've seen them move in traditional kestrel territories, but it's not, and so it's not surprising that some kind of interest-specific conflict does occur. However, it's more likely the combination of impacts that are causing the kestrel decline, not the impacts of the buzzards. So, but obviously there's a lot more work to be done, and I think it is being done to quantify the kestrel decline. And that's me finished. I think I'd just like to thank Andy and Sam, Steve Binney, and my mate Andrew, who died a few years ago, for some of his pictures for this. So that's me finished. Thank you for listening.